we're out here trying to tell stories of courage and hope. We've really always been looking for where are the instances where things are coming together in a way that these spiritual longings are being met, right? So we really want to understand more about where and why that is happening, and we want to catalyze more of it, right?
I'm Brandon Vaidyanathan, and this is Beauty at Work, the podcast that seeks to expand our understanding of beauty, what it is, how it works, and why it matters for the work we do. This season of the podcast is sponsored by Templeton Religion Trust and is focused on the beauty and burdens of innovation. What does spiritual innovation look like on the ground, in real communities, and what does it take to make it both responsible and beautiful? Addressing these questions are my guests today, Casper Ter Kuile and Angie Thurston. Casper and Angie are co-founders of Sacred Design Lab. Casper is the author of The Power of Ritual, co-creator of the podcast Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, and co-founder of Nearness. He holds master's degrees in public policy and divinity from Harvard, where he served as a ministry innovation fellow, and he speaks widely on the future of ritual, community, and beauty. Angie is co-founder and executive director of Sacred Design Lab and has worked with hundreds of innovative leaders addressing spiritual longings in a time of religious change. She's co-written 8 public reports, including the widely influential How We Gather, and partnered with organizations from On Being and Esalen to Pinterest and IDEO, as well as major religious denominations. She now serves as an executive fellow at Harvard Business School, helping develop the new course, The Spiritual Lives of Leaders. In our conversation, we will trace the founding of Sacred Design Lab and the unmet needs that they're tracking: belonging, meaning, formation, and the spiritual infrastructure that innovators require. We dive into their new Spiritual Innovation Report, looking at their goals and methodology and findings from interviews across 37 countries, and discuss the emerging Spiritual Innovation Hub they're developing. Along the way, we talk about the opportunities and burdens of spiritual innovation and what they're seeing among Gen Z. Let's get started. All right, Casper and Angie, it's a pleasure to have you both on the podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having
Thanks
us.
for having us.
Yeah, you're welcome. Well, to get started, I had sent you guys a question, which I normally ask my podcast guests to begin with, which is, could you share a memory of beauty from your childhoods that linger till today? I wonder what cropped up in your minds as I ask this question. Perhaps Angie, we could start with you.
I would love to. And it's such a nice question. Thank you, Brandon. So I grew up in San Francisco, and I was 4 years old during the earthquake of 1989, which, of course, in and of itself, I would not necessarily describe with that word beauty, but there is a specific memory that I have from that day. And for context, my nuclear family was really isolated. I didn't grow up with much family around, and we didn't have much community either. But that night, all the power went out in San Francisco, and we were lucky enough that our house was mostly okay. And because of that, there were a few people in my parents' life who came over that evening. And I remember falling asleep, and in the next room, my parents were there with some friends by candlelight, and they were laughing and talking and sort of whispering. And I just had this feeling that I hadn't had much in my life to date as a kid of, I guess I would say it was a feeling of belonging. It was a feeling of just that sort of subtle web of life and connection that I was part of and they were part of. And I think part of the beauty of it to me was this feeling that I didn't have to do anything. I was just there in my bed as a 4-year-old, and I could just fall asleep, and this set of relationships, this love was happening anyway. And there was
Wow.
just sort of a givenness to it. And I still remember that sense inside of myself from that particular experience, and the feeling that it has is one of beauty.
Wow, that's extraordinary. Thank you. Yeah. Casper, what came to your mind?
Well, Brandon, I have to thank you. Angie and I have worked together for 12 years, and it's rare that I hear a story that I haven't heard before, but that's lovely, Ange. Thanks for sharing that. Brandon, I grew up in the UK, and I went to a Waldorf school as a child. So I don't know how much our listeners will be familiar with kind of Steiner education, but it's a very ritual heavy, kind of nature-based, fascinating theological project of kind of combining Christianity with Hindu reincarnation, very interesting kind of things to explore there. But one of the gifts of growing up in a Waldorf school was that they encouraged parents, and so my mother did this in our home, to have a nature table. And what that looked like was in the hallway, the kind of entryway of our home. And I grew up with three sisters, and we had lodgers living upstairs. So it was a big house filled with people. But in the entryway, there was this little table, and each kind of season, really every few weeks, it changed. There were postcards of if it was in the summer season, there would be like beaches, and in the autumn there would be beautiful leaves that were changing color, and in Advent season there would be 24 stars that little mini Joseph and Mary would walk over, kind of one star every day towards the manger of Bethlehem. And so it was just this sense of living in time, and I think that's for me where the beauty really was. It was that the visual, of flowers or rocks or crystals or something, but it was a constant reminder that where we were in the kind of natural life cycle of the earth and its seasons. And so that's something. I recently moved house and was kind of having conversation with my husband about what makes a house a home, and I was like, we must have a nature table. That's
Oh,
non-negotiable.
wow.
um,
Well, that's great. That's really quite a testament to your school there and to the
yeah.
Waldorf method. And these themes of both belonging and of ritual, perhaps, are so central to the work y'all are doing at Sacred Design Lab. How did you two meet, and how did you come to start this initiative, Sacred Design Lab?
So Casper and I met in 2013 in our very first week, perhaps one of our first days at Harvard Divinity School. We had both come in, well, Casper had come in to get a public policy degree at the Kennedy School. So he had been there at the university for a little while, but I was newly arrived, and we were both in the same required seminar, an introduction to ministry studies. And it was in that seminar that we had the requirement to share our spiritual autobiographies, just each of us sharing kind of our origin story and how our lives intersected with religion and spirituality. And the way I remember it is that when Casper shared his spiritual autobiography, I basically pounced on him after class and was like, you see what I see. We need to work together. And basically what that was that both of us had come of age outside of religion in the sort of formal institutional sense. And both of us had a real sense that there were a lot of needs, which I think we would both now describe as spiritual needs, spiritual longings, that were occurring for people who did not have a sense of religious identity or religious community, and that we wanted to, in some ways, serve people who were feeling that way. And so we became friends, but pretty quickly. I think even when we would have dinner together, we would have an agenda. So it became quickly quite clear that we had work to do together.
Wow.
I don't
Wow,
know what
that's
you would
extraordinary.
add or change, Casper, about that narrative.
No, I think that's exactly right. Yeah, I would only say that Angie and I, as we became friends, just started to learn together. We started to interview people who were doing kind of spiritual or religious things in secular places. So our interest was really trying to understand this kind of landscape, especially of our generation of millennials at that point, who were outside of religion but still doing religious things. And so we ended up writing this kind of, I hesitate to say this to an academic like yourself, but a sort of public paper that was
Sure.
really aimed at a general readership to try and illustrate not what the dominant narrative was at the time, which really was a decline of religion, but from our perspective, really a transformation of religion, so that people were still being spiritual, doing spiritual things, but in places like CrossFit or maker spaces or the workplace or artistic communities. And so we've always had this kind of dual role, which I've loved about working with Angie, of both being kind of students of what's happening and having a leg into the academy and into research, but also really as practitioners, as people who are really invested in this personally and creating projects, creating interventions, creating media that speak to that landscape at the same time. And we keep finding ways to work together.
It's astounding. Casper, you'd also started a very influential podcast on Harry Potter. Could you say a word about how that fit into all of this?
Well, this is a great example of kind of one of those practitioner projects. Another classmate of ours, Vanessa Zoltan, in divinity school, and I became friends, and she was doing this fascinating kind of writing about reading a sacred text. She grew up as an atheist Jew. That would be the language she used, and where belief in God was not part of the picture, but the practices of religious life certainly were, and sacred reading was a big part of that. But she didn't want to read the Torah, and so she was reading Jane Eyre as a sacred text with one of our beloved professors, Stephanie Purcell. And I found this quite intriguing. I was like, what is sacred reading? I didn't know anything about Lectio Divina, or, the kind of Ignatian imagination practices, or Havruta or Pardes of Jewish practices. And so I went along to this little group that she was hosting on a Wednesday night with, 3 or 4 women who were reading a chapter of Jane Eyre, taking a sentence and doing Lectio Divina with it, and having these amazing conversations about mental health and heartbreak and love and courage. And I said to Vanessa, this is really awesome. We should do it with a book people actually read. And so, um, which is, I mean, no disrespect to the Brontes, but what that led to was it kind of paired with my own exploration of, not growing up Christian. And so having to take an introduction to Hebrew Bible in Church and New Testament class, and finding it interesting, but at the same time not feeling like it was my text to interrogate, or I didn't have a relationship with it. That's changed now. But at that point, I was really looking for, what are the epic stories? What are the myths, the legends that I feel like I have a right to engage with, to interpret? And so I was interested in Lord of the Rings. I was interested in Game of Thrones. I was interested in Harry Potter. And so those two kind of influences came together, and we were extremely lucky. Always go to the conference that you're invited to, because I met this random guy at a conference who happened to be the man in charge of the homepage of iTunes at that point. And so when we launched the podcast, having run it as an in-person class for a year, when we launched the podcast, I sent it to this guy, and he was like, "Oh, this is cool. I'm going to put you on the homepage." And that ended up attracting just an enormous audience. And what happened was that we really became sort of chaplains to a fandom. And so that podcast has been running nearly for 10 years now, and it will close next year in 2026, having read through all the books twice, chapter by chapter. And it led to hundreds of local reading groups that would do Lectio Divina with the Harry Potter books. We run secular pilgrimages now. There's a thriving digital community. So it's been amazing to see how people who would never go looking for spiritual practices, but they were looking for the comfort and the connection of the story that they loved. And we always say we don't read it as entertainment. We read it as in not instruction per se, but as an opportunity to mirror back into our own lives the big questions about values, about how to live a good life, and the text and these practices particularly really help you kind of use the text as a mirror to ask yourself big questions.
Yeah, amazing. So how did this idea for the Sacred Design Lab then come about in the midst of all this? And what was it that that spurred you to actually create this thing? And then what are you trying to do presently with it?
Well, Casper alluded to this report we wrote, this public paper, How We Gather, back in 2015, and it is worth re-emphasizing. We were just grad students at the time, right? And we had some shared priorities about the kind of work we wanted to do. The kind of, I would say, both of us were really looking at these innovative communities that seemed to be meeting needs that perhaps in many cases religion, both historically and currently, would meet, but that the kind of people in our orbit, especially at the time we were looking at millennials who tended to be religiously unaffiliated or uncomfortably affiliated, we were asking, where are they going to find meaning and belonging and purpose? And so that led to this little report, How We Gather, but it also led us to get to know a whole host of these innovative community leaders around the United States. And what kept happening, and I had trained before that as a playwright, and it was, these folks who were running fitness communities and arts communities and justice movements, they seemed to be dissimilar. And yet it was as if they had a shared script about the kinds of work that they were doing and the ways that it was touching people and meeting them. And what we found is that these leaders, in many respects, were acting in a sort of pastoral role for the people in their communities, even though their communities were nominally secular. And so we began to learn about their needs. And one of the primary needs that we noticed amongst them was that they felt awfully lonely in their leadership and that they also felt under-resourced in the dimensions of their leadership that were addressing these deeper needs amongst the people in their care. And so we started gathering these leaders. And at first, we were gathering secular leaders. Then we started gathering leaders whose communities actually did have a religious affiliation, or where the leader themselves might, but where the community was not. It kind of looked more like these innovative secular communities than it did your traditional congregational model, for instance. So this was things like people meeting in laundromats and washing clothes for those who might be experiencing homelessness as a kind of expression of modern day foot washing, right? Or Muslim small groups meeting in living rooms, at the time online Buddhist sanghas, before before COVID and everyone
For
going
COVID,
online.
yeah.
So that became a sort of network that Casper and I were cultivating amongst these leaders. We've come to call these folks spiritual innovators. At the time, we didn't have that language yet. And so that's one big strand that I would say has run through our work and still does to this day. That was some of the impetus behind founding Sacred Design Lab. But the other was that as we continued getting to know these innovative leaders and working with them, we also received an unexpected response from a lot of institutions. And at first, this was religious institutions, and everything from denominations to large scale congregations and foundations, people basically asking what is going on with rising generations. And in many cases, they were experiencing institutional decline. And so they wanted to talk to us and understand what was going on. And then sometimes secular organizations would sort of be encountering the same challenges, the cultural challenges of, oh, we have this huge rise in loneliness, right, and a sense of isolation. We have these a rise in mental health and it challenges, and people experiencing this kind of ennui, and in some cases devastation. What's going on with that, and how do we respond in the secular landscape? And we were sort of saying, well, actually, there's a lot of wisdom in religion about this, right? So we became a kind of we found ourselves in a bridge position. And so when we graduated from divinity school in 2016, we said, okay, well, I think Casper and I sort of looked at each other like, are we going to do this for real? Are we going to
Right.
try to do this as our job? And it's been a long and meandering road since then of how we've made it work. But ultimately, we did found Sacred Design Lab with our colleague Sue about 7 years ago now, to really try to bring together this body of work and see what we could meaningfully contribute.
Yeah. Wow. Could you say a little bit about, I mean, and you talked about sort of these, fundamental unmet needs that you're trying to address. Say a bit more about the design and the lab aspects of what you're trying to do.
Well, there's a few parts of that. One is that Angie and I just like to do a lot of interesting things, and using a word like lab allows you to do that. But in
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
seriousness, it
Yeah.
allowed us to partner with very different types of groups for projects that all touched on these same questions, but in very different contexts. So, for example, we worked with the Episcopal Bishop in Chicago to host a liturgy lab. So this was a small convening in which we brought together secular experience designers who worked as museum curators, or hosted festivals, like music festivals, together with Episcopal liturgists who were steeped both in the scholarship of liturgy, but also in the practice of it in Episcopal congregations. And that led to some fascinating insights of applying this idea of spiritual innovation, of how do we meet those enduring needs in ways that really resonate with audiences that won't necessarily walk into an Episcopal church. And one insight that I'll never forget is Ida Benedetto, who is an amazing experience designer who lives here in Brooklyn, not too far away from me. Had done some research looking at, of all things, wilderness retreats, funerals, and sex parties. And her insight was that for transformation to occur, you needed an element of risk. And when she shared that in this group of Episcopal liturgists, I remember Patrick, Mahoney, I think is his last name, the former dean at St. John the Divine, saying, my goodness, as a liturgist, I'm nearly always designing for safety. What would it be like to design for risk in liturgy? So those kind of conversations, don't happen by themselves. And so that was one element of the lab. But we've also created, in partnership with the Wellbeing Trust, a foundation that came out of the healthcare sector, that was really interested in understanding, okay, we understand social health, we understand mental health. What is spiritual health? Can you help us think through what does that look like? And so we both did a bunch of research and then created our own kind of personal inventory and sort of a mini self-analysis tool that you could use to just get in touch with what is my spiritual health? How do I think about the different elements, the contours of what might make up my spiritual well-being? So the lab allows those kind of, unlikely partnerships, but with a continued question of how do we nurture spiritual life today and tomorrow?
Amazing. Great. One of the more recent research products you put out is this amazing report on illuminating spiritual innovation. Could you say a little bit about what you mean by spiritual innovation? What led you to, I suppose, to focus on that word? And what do you mean by spiritual innovation? And say a little bit about the work you did, the actual the research, what where you went, who you talked to, and what you were trying to learn in doing that work.
Well, I would say that the origin of us using that phrase really dates back to this time that we've just been describing, where I think Casper and I both came to this body of work from a real, with real practitioner hearts, and I would say with in a very capacious use of the word ministry, a desire to
Right.
minister, to serve in a context that was rapidly changing. And so this idea of spiritual innovation, I think for us has always had something to do with how do you meet the soul needs, the spiritual longings of those who, in general, in general, but I think especially in a context where a number of the traditional structures and institutions and even in some cases theologies and rituals are not fit for purpose amongst a growing population. So what do you do about that? It really has felt to us in some ways like a design question. I think going back to your question about why we called it Sacred Design Lab, there's a whole host of really rich and challenging design questions at stake right now. And so I think for us, we were really wanting to build on the scholarship and practitioner wisdom about this concept of innovation and apply it to the question of spiritual needs and spiritual longings. So when we use it, that's what we mean by it, is we're looking at new ways to address spiritual longings. And let me say that, of course, that word innovation can be quite fraught in certain contexts and can have a lot of overtones depending on where you are socially located, geographically, religiously. And so that has been a big part of our work in trying to find language that is effective enough, that's meaningful enough to get at this work, and yet also sort of capacious enough to hold it. And I think it's imperfect. And so as a result, we will often also accompany the phrase spiritual innovation with other words, spiritual imagination, spiritual transformation, spiritual evolution, spiritual adaptation, we were just talking about. So it's imperfect language, but I think the fact that it is connected to some bodies of work around how you design for meaningful change is helpful, because that is a big part of what we want to support.
And so, kind of practically, what the research involved was a huge amount of interviews with spiritual innovators and scholars around the world. And we were lucky enough to visit a number of countries. We were in Japan, Brazil, Angie was in India, I was in Egypt, we were in Kenya, the UAE, and of course, here in the US as well. But our work had really been very US focused before. So it was a real excitement for us to be able to kind of expand our scholarly gaze and look beyond into very different contexts. And in some ways, I would say we were surprised by how much alignment there was with the US context. Like certainly there were very, very different national situations or religious contexts. Islam in particular, being in Egypt was really interesting to kind of understand that more, and the UAE. But we worked with a team of postgrads, mostly researchers in kind of 7 different regions. So we had just more than 100 interviews with practitioners and scholars. And it was fascinating. One of my most memorable interviews was in Egypt. I was in Cairo meeting with Amir Khaled, who was, if you're on the streets of Egypt and you ask anyone, who is he, everybody knows. He was kind of the face of he was the first kind of televangelist, you might say, in the 90s. And he's just had a multi-decade kind of public presence and has always used technology very innovatively. So he was, the first to be out, sold in, tapes and cassettes and then DVDs on street corners. Now is in this really interesting place where his kind of theology, his kind of theological project is to combine traditional Islamic theology with positive psychology. So he's integrating kind of a more recent, scientific research base, aligning it with traditional Islamic theology to create a sort of formation path. And that's my language, not his, but he talks a lot about ihsan, the idea of kind of perfection, of growing towards perfection, and teaches that through a series of digital programming and fellowships and leadership cohorts with young Muslims around Europe and North Africa, having him reflect on his own experience of being influenced by his travels in India, of this, kind of secular scholarship, and yet embedding it in kind of a Muslim worldview was just a fascinating example of someone innovating within a tradition. And I should say that this idea of spiritual innovation really does sit both outside of traditions, inside, and at the edge of it. And so whenever we were doing these kind of research, whether it was a Buddhist monk in Japan who teaches surfing lessons and then builds in some meditation to kind of sneak that in, whether it's people creatively building it into a tradition, or something like Homecoming, a digital platform that helps people integrate psychedelic experiences, that's based in Canada. That's totally outside of religious context, but still very, very much engaging a lot of spiritual practices, even if it's in a sort of medical frame.
Right, right. Angie, is there a story from one of your cases that surprised you or maybe challenged your assumptions or that you found especially striking?
Yeah, well, Casper was just speaking about Japan, and I think that was one of the most moving for me was when we were outside of Tokyo. We were in a Buddhist temple, and part of the learning for me around the way that a lot of the Buddhist lineages in Japan are passed down is that it's often within families. You'll have multiple generations. And so there's still a decision point for someone who is engaged in that kind of leadership, but there is also a sense of inheritance and responsibility, right? And so this particular spiritual innovator, this monk, Reverend Fujio, was speaking to us about how he has tried to respond to the crisis of isolation in Japan, which is part of why we chose to go to Japan, is because that is so acute there, and there's also a lot of deaths of despair in Japan right now, and especially in among young people. And so Reverend Fujio had a lot of direct impacts of this in his own life. He had lost a few friends to suicide, and he just saw the way that, if you here in the United States where we're based, some people will look at religious spaces, in some cases Christian spaces, because that's our dominant religion in the United States, and say, well, I go there just for holidays, right? For Christmas and Easter, or for funerals, And that's the relationship that a lot of people in Japan have to Buddhist temples. It's more for ceremonial purposes and can feel to some people out of touch with everyday life. And Reverend Fujio just said, I think that it's my work to actually go straight into the social problems that I see with the tradition that I have inherited. And so he has dedicated himself to ministering to those who are feeling so depleted that they're in a mental health crisis. And so he basically lives his life as a vigil and makes himself available for people to come. And he will, if they come, he will just sit with them. And basically the metaphor he used was, I help them recharge their battery. So he'll start with the physical level and just say, are you hot? Are you cold? Do you need water? And then he'll walk zazen with them for as long as they need in order to feel that they can actually access their body again before he'll even go to any matters of the mind or of the heart or the spirit. And he has taken this into the metaverse. So he leads Zazen in the metaverse and started doing this during COVID. So they have like a whole sort of virtual version of the temple that anyone can join. And he also has started a collective of other spiritual practitioners, mostly Buddhist monks and chaplains, who are dedicated to working together around this issue of how they prevent suicide. So there's this kind of intersection of working with technology, working with social problems, and also deeply drawing out the gifts of his tradition, in terms of especially that sort of commitment to practice and the wisdom of what it is like to actually put your body in different positions in order to help access different states. So anyway, I was just very touched by his devotion and the ways that he's applying creative energy to this particular predicament.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Well, a lot of the examples you've cited seem to certainly resonate with problems that we're familiar with in the West here, right? Like loneliness and the kind of general kind of secularization, the alienation from ourselves, from our received traditions. Did you find any problems or crises that are rather different, perhaps, from what we experience in the West?
Yeah, I think the role of the state was really interesting. Certainly, when we were in Brazil, for example, meeting with practitioners of Umbunda and a host of different kind of African traditions that have mutated and changed in the Brazilian context. Many were very actively repressed for a long time, and it was interesting. We were in Rio in February, and so we happened to be there on the celebration day of Iamanja, who is kind of the ocean water divinity or deity. People wear white, go to the beach, offer kind of gifts of thanks. So people bring food, flowers. Couple of bottles of champagne were spotted, which other, as ever in these kind of ritual spaces, you have some people engaging in a beautiful practice of devotion. Others are there just to pick up the free food and champagne that is left on the beach. But rather than the state, having played this very repressive role, now this was municipally celebrated and funded because it's now seen as a draw for tourism. So just the changing way in which kind of state interaction with traditions, especially in post-colonial contexts. Brazil was a particular example where it had been embraced. That's certainly not always the case. But that was something that did feel noticeably different from the US. I don't know, Angie, if there's others that come to mind for you.
Yeah, I would say that that theme writ large, and this is part of the discomfort with the language of innovation in especially, I think we experience that in the Middle East and in Muslim contexts because of the association of innovation with Bida and with this idea of in new invention inside of Islam, which is essentially seen as heresy in many cases. That was one important difference of context in terms of, I'd say broadly in the United States there is a culture of lionizing innovation and entrepreneurship, right? A sense of that is a path to getting ahead, is to creating something new, and that while that's not always true in religious spaces in the United States, I think it is the kind of the cultural water that we swim in. So that was definitely not the case, I'd say, in Muslim majority context, and then also I'd say especially in Africa and Latin America with the specifics of colonialism, and I think also American hegemony was a big
Yeah,
factor. I mean, we really
Absolutely.
experienced the pushback against that language, specifically with the connotation of, oh, we're going to take something and essentially exploit it and use it for profit. Like that
right,
was the
right, right, right,
specific
right.
association with innovation in an American context and also in a colonial context, right? We're just going to sort of pilfer what's here and use it for our own gain as the sort of colonizer culture. And so that the strong pushback, I'd say, the sort of counter perspective that we often were met with in these conversations was one in which, well, everything is naturally evolving. If you look at the natural world, that there's a quality of transformation that is just part of our existence, and we are part of that. And so the idea that humans would come in and be the inventors, be the innovators, be the ones to come up with something new is actually just an inaccurate understanding of the world, and kind of based on a colonial logic that is counter to and has done violence to a lot of cultures around the world. So I'd say there was pretty strong resistance in a lot of cases, even while I think there were also a number of experiences of this shared conundrum of people really trying to figure out how to live in today's world in a way that is meaningful and rich and grounded in something beyond themselves and contending with that struggle. So I think, as Casper said earlier, there were some through lines there. We had a really beautiful dinner with a group of young people it was in Dubai, right, Casper, where,
Hmm.
we were sort of finding some of our peers in that context who were sharing on a personal level, how they're holding the religion that they grew up with alongside the realities of their life today, right? So that was there in a sort of personal individual expression. But at the cultural level, we're dealing with really different contexts.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's great. Dubai happens to be my own spiritual home, so it's for
No
various
way.
reasons. It's yeah, it's I lived there for a number of years, so I have a very yeah, it's very dear to me. But when you I mean, you obviously you're calling all these folks spiritual innovators, whether or not they embrace the term. What are the so I suppose the factors that are most predictive of their success, or what does success look like? I mean, in terms of spiritual innovation, and what factors contribute to whether or not an innovation gains traction?
Yeah, well, now I'm always grateful that there's two of us because, Ange, we can collectively maybe remember the seven different things that we came up with.
Well, we could start with the three big buckets of
Yes, let's start that.
needs that we've
Yeah,
found. Yeah,
you do
which is, I
you
mean,
do
this
that.
is very sort of straightforwardly, Brandon, in our last decade of working with these folks, we found they have a host of practical needs of
Yeah,
actually being able to create and sustain new things in the world, projects of any
right.
kind. They have a lot of relational needs. We spoke to the feeling of loneliness that often they would experience in their leadership because they're not quite in any one world in that way. And so there's a need for mentorship and for elder, that, and also for peers. And then their spiritual needs. How did they go deep with the people in their care? Well, they have to be accessing that space of spiritual nourishment themselves, right? So I'd say those three areas for the innovators themselves, we found that successful innovation, the success of their work is often very connected to the extent to which their needs are being met in those three areas. And then, as Casper was beginning to allude to, we've noticed a host of qualities from what we would describe as sort of effective or successful or promising spiritual innovation. And I would say they all sort of connect to this idea. I mean, there's many words for what is the more ideal, what Charles Eisenstein would say, the more beautiful world, speaking of beauty, that our hearts know is possible. If we're trying to move toward something like that, we could use the language of flourishing or thriving, but successful spiritual innovation is helping us move toward that world, right? In ourselves, in our communities, in the larger ecosystems that we share and the societies that we're part of. So that's broadly what we were on the lookout for, is what are the conditions that lead to that kind of innovation.
Yeah, and maybe some of those specifics, just to mention, some that we were interested in. Definitely, one was scalability, without falling prey to the bigger is better. But certainly, we were looking for things that had the opportunity to reach a significant number of people. So, for example, we would be less interested in an individual practitioner who might offer particular, one-on-one, whether it's Reiki or healing or something, even if that was being combined in an interesting way with a different practice or an unusual context. We were mostly interested in things that could serve multiple people and hopefully at some significant scale. A project sustainability is something, having looked at this kind of question for 12 years, there have been so many awesome projects that have come and gone. A lot of individual creative, and that's normal in a kind of innovation stage, but so many wonderful projects really depended on a single individual often who
Right.
put in the labor and the creativity and was able to make it work, but then had a baby or moved away or had a health crisis or got a job that could pay for their health insurance or whatever it
Yeah.
was. We're definitely really interested in what are the models, the financial models that make these kind of projects work. And there are a host of different ones, from member sustained projects to more of some of them are like venture backed, for example. So, if you look at some of the big apps that most of us will be familiar with, like Insight Timer or Headspace or Hallow, time will tell how long they survive once the venture money runs out. To projects that are entirely volunteer run, like Service Space, for example, which has a huge reach, or other models that are experimenting with things like cooperatives or social enterprise model where something is revenue generating that cross subsidizes something that's then offered for free. So we've been very curious to try and understand how those different models work. That's a continuing conundrum, I would say, if not maybe always the first question, certainly one of the most significant questions we had over and over again that spiritual innovators struggle with.
Yeah. I would imagine some of these would certainly be universal in terms of the funding model, for instance, and or leadership transitions, or what sort of contributes to their ability to endure over time, and across generations, and manage their various expectations of followers, if you want to call them members, or whatever they might be called, right? The other thing I was curious about was whether you see any downsides or pitfalls or unintended consequences
Oh,
of
sure.
spiritual innovation.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many. The obvious ones are often about failed leadership. Our first kind of case study that we often ended up talking about in the early years of our research was fitness communities and CrossFit especially. And so a classic example there of you know people being responsible for kind of soul care in a way that they were not trained for. Someone who's excellent at helping you with your form as you lift a barbell, but maybe not very skilled in navigating your mother's cancer diagnosis. And so the most egregious examples of that would have been, inappropriate romantic relationships between someone who's in a leadership role and someone who's, a participant. But there's so many, all the things that go wrong in a congregation also go wrong in these projects. So financial mismanagement, burnout, team conflict, you name it, it happens. I think some of the more philosophically interesting examples are often about the ethics of translating a tradition. So as people are innovating, that taking a practice from one place and putting it in a new context, or as I did with the Harry Potter podcast, we were drawing on the Lectio Divina tradition, which of course itself was a spiritual innovation. Guido II, Carthusian monk of the 14th century, was adapting a different formula for engaging with a biblical text, and he put it into these 4 steps, which we now think of as, the golden approach to
Right.
Lectio Divina. But it came from somewhere too. So we often quote
Yeah.
Rabbi Owen Kuile, who says, every innovation, every tradition was once an innovation. But so that question of ethic is really paramount. And so what are the reflection questions you need? What are the relationships you need? What are the kind of support and accountability structures of mentorship that are really important? And that's a lot of what we spend our time doing in terms of supporting spiritual innovators now, is trying to help them build that bench of support structures, of relationships, because we know that when they hit inevitable challenges, it's the network of support and accountability that helps people through, or where they get lost, where something comes undone. And so I would say that kind of question of leadership and ethics and translating tradition are two of the things that stand out for me.
Yeah, our colleague Sue Phillips has this beautiful phrase about the spiritual infrastructure of the future. She wrote a great article on it. And I think that's part of the predicament, is that there is, if you think about, of course, the structure, the organizational structures are different across religious traditions, but usually they do include some amount of training and formation for leadership, right? And they include also some amount of support for people once they're in positions of leadership. And that's not to mention all of the other kinds of infrastructure that exist around, if you think about just religious life, all of the elements that go into that, right? So if someone is in a position where they're spiritually innovating, what we have found is that there are pretty massive infrastructure gaps. And so all those questions Casper was just naming, whether it's about ethics and leadership, whether it's about how you sustain your work financially, or even how you make a decision about the way that you want to approach this question of money and livelihood as it relates to being called to a kind of work that has a deep spiritual core, that kind of interrogation. And then the practices and the relationships that will sustain an ongoing journey of this kind of work. We're just in a very sort of broadly transitional time when it comes to all of that. And that transition is accompanied by, of course, these additional macro forces like the rise in all of these technologies and things like that we're also having to contend with in real time. So I think there are a lot of perils to spiritual innovation in that kind of landscape. And there are real risks as far as, people just, you hope most of the time they're well meaning, but kind of putting themselves out there and meeting people who have real needs, whether or not someone else sitting over here would say that they're qualified or authorized to do that or should be doing it, right? And sometimes that can indeed lead to real harm being done. So I guess that's a big part of our hope and our project at Sacred Design Lab is to do our best, to make a contribution that will support this work being done with integrity and consideration, and also to help with the advancement of some of those elements of spiritual infrastructure, so that people are less alone in doing the work, and not so much casting about, as if they're doing it for the first time, because actually there are centuries of wisdom about how to do this work well.
Right, yeah. And I mentioned that's part of the challenge there is some of these innovators at least are responding to a perceived frustration with, existing traditions that they're coming out of, and maybe even just the desire for autonomy from those traditions and wanting to perhaps the desire to chart out new territory and venture out on one's own and try to find an authentic way of engaging with some of these perennial questions, perhaps in ways that no one has done before, but are meeting our current needs right now, might make them resistant to looking to established traditions for any help,
What
right?
I would say though, Brandon, is that the resistance often is about institutions
Right,
rather than
right.
individuals. And so one of the kind of lab projects that we ran a few years ago was to pair up spiritual innovators with elders, mostly ordained leaders across different traditions, for a sort of 6-month relationship building incubation
Oh, lovely.
experiment. And the
Yeah,
minimum requirement was that they met for an hour each month on Zoom just to talk. And
yeah,
we framed this in for the elders so that they were engaging the conversations appropriately, and we gave them some questions to offer. And overwhelmingly, that was a really positive experience for both ends of the conversation. We would have an older rabbi talk with a young former Muslim, but now kind of secular yoga innovator, or we had an older Presbyterian minister with gosh, I'm trying to remember who it was in particular. But anyway, these kind of very unexpected conversations, and nearly always there was such appreciation for the wisdom that came through both ways. It was energizing and exciting for the older person, and grounding and helpful to be reminded that the questions and the challenges that they were experiencing as an innovator is one that these older folks had to navigate too, whether it was in a congregational context or something else.
yeah.
What I'm trying to illustrate with this point is that resistance is less significant than you might expect if there is curiosity and generosity in an approach in the context of a relationship. I
Yeah,
think you're right that there's real misgivings about the power structures and everything else within institutions,
right.
but interpersonally, it was actually much more open.
Wow, wow, that's
Well,
fascinating.
and that speaks to you were asking about the burden of innovation, Brendan, and I
Yeah,
think a burden that many of these spiritual innovators carry is the feeling that if they want something to exist, they have to create it. And that if they are creating it, they're doing so for the first time. I mean, I know it's factually untrue, but it can feel that way, and in part because of how cut off many of these folks are from others who have done things like this. And to your point about doing it, especially outside of religious institutions, if they haven't been connected to those kinds of institutions, they just genuinely don't necessarily know that someone in that kind of position would have wisdom that's relevant for what they're doing. And so that was part of the pilot that Casper just references. We wanted to just create conditions for them to actually meet each other and have that type of conversation, to relieve some of the burden.
yeah, yeah. No, and that sort of mentorship is critical, and just to know that someone else has done something similar, or that there is wisdom somewhere, right? That this really is, you don't really have to reinvent the wheel. But I think it's also, I mean, what I appreciate about your work too is it dispels the misconception that it's pretty pervasive that spirituality is somehow immune to the problems that are associated with traditional religion, right? It's this pure, positive, uniformly beneficial thing.
For sure. And I would say because of that, the way, whether scholars agree with this or not, the way people perceive the difference between religion and spirituality on the street is that religion is institutional and spirituality is personal. But what happens within that realm once it's taken out of the kind of institutional context is that spirituality and the market become very, very quickly intertwined. And so I think one of the biggest challenges on that ethics question that we were talking about before is what about money? And what can you charge for, what shouldn't be charged for, how do you make a living, but at the same time how do you respect a tradition? And especially as some of these themes around spirituality, especially ritual, becomes more and more popular as a kind of a brand tool. I mean, literally the makeup brand rituals, right? So
Right.
you see this language kind of being co-opted by the capitalist market. Now, at the same time, does religion itself have a challenging history with, capitalism? Absolutely. So I think you're so right to point to even though on the face of it, we might think these are very different contexts and different challenges, it's a lot of the same stuff.
Yeah, yeah. I'm curious to know what you're seeing in the work you're doing in relation to Gen Z. I mean, the problems that you identified in your report on how we gather were focused maybe on the millennial context, but are you seeing there's talks about a religious resurgence or revival or whatever you want to call it among Gen Z to turning towards maybe more traditional forms of religion? I don't know to what extent that's borne out in data, but are you seeing that kind of or any particular patterns among the youngest generation right now?
And I can start, and I'll let you build
Sure.
in build
Yeah,
in
that
more.
sounds good.
So I would say, yes, you're so right that our kind of intro framing was definitely around millennials. And so we haven't focused specifically on Gen Zs over the last couple of years. So I want to caveat everything that I'm going to say next. And I think you're right to point to the difference between the narrative and the data. I think Ryan Burge's work has been very illustrative of kind of not seeing the evidence yet in the hard numbers. However, and I think here is the key thing that I find most interesting, which is that as younger generations have less of a personal experience of religious life, religious institutions, they don't have the same reaction or reactivity to institutional religion that maybe people who had a particular wounding experience did. So, as people are born outside of religious tradition, rather than kind of like, oh, religion is bad, it's more just like religion is irrelevant. And then if there's something that's interesting about it, whether that's like religious iconography being used on the runway, right, in a fashion context, or the way in which like becoming really devout is somehow countercultural now, right? Like there's a different context is what I'm trying to point to for Gen Zs, in which engaging religion doesn't mean what it did for a Gen X, certainly not for a boomer context or even a millennial one. So I'm not saying that there's a religious revival per se, but what I do think is true is that younger people are very conscious that the way things are is not how they should be. And they're curious to understand whether it's a relationship with technology, for example. If you have an answer, I want it. And if you're religious or if you're secular, I'm actually pretty open to you as a source of guidance in a way that wouldn't have been the case 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, just building on that, I think I have sort of, after Casper and I moved out of Harvard Divinity School, I have stayed connected to the university, both at Harvard and now a little bit more at Columbia. And I have noticed that amongst at least the students that I've been working with, there is a sense, to Casper's point, of certainly just an assumption that things are not as they should be. And then additionally, I think a sense that educational institutions being one place that they are still finding themselves with spending a lot of time, but that those institutions also don't seem to be set up to address some of these questions either. And so, right, the questions like about meaning and purpose and belonging. And I think that I've experienced a relative openness to trying to locate sources of wisdom about those topics. And I think we see that borne out in some of the courses that are especially popular at universities across the country. At Harvard, there's one on Confucius and the Good Life, which is always massively oversubscribed. There's the one on happiness at Yale. There's like these sort of positive, and anything that's, you know what I mean? Like it's actually about, well, who am I and what does it mean for me to
Yeah,
have a good life? And why am I
yeah,
spending my time the way, these just sort of fundamental and existential questions. If one is coming of age not having had those questions spoken to either in a religious setting or an educational setting, then as you approach your 20s, there's just this significant vacuum, right? And I think
yeah.
that is a perilous situation. And of course, we're seeing a lot of people, of course, turning to the people who are online to tell them about those things, right? And for better and for worse, definitely.
Mm.
um,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
right. But
yeah,
that those questions
yeah,
have not gone away. And so I would say whether it's playing out in a religious revival or it's playing out in terms of people finding gurus on the internet, they're going to look. People are going to look. And the question is what's going to be there to meet them.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you. You're also currently catalyzing a hub for spiritual innovation or for spiritual innovators. Could you tell us a little bit about what you're doing, what you're designing to solve there, what success is going to look like for you, what you're aspiring to there?
Yeah, so after this research phase of getting to interview all these spiritual innovators around the world, we heard again and again, as Angie said, the need for relational support, practical support, and spiritual support. And so one thing we thought we could do is to create just the biggest library of resources for spiritual innovation that we could think of. So we've collected over 350 podcast episodes, books, articles, frameworks, anything, organizations, anything that might be of value, and we've organized them in a sort of choose your own adventure structure. So listeners can go to spiritualinnovation.org and pick a theme like, fund your project, or questions around leadership or ethics, those challenges that we mentioned before, and find a curated kind of pathway with videos of real life stories from practitioners, some guidance with examples to point to, and then all of these resources to help hopefully meet some of the practical needs that innovators have. And then secondly, we've got a directory in which spiritual innovators around the world can create a profile, share a little bit about what they're interested in, what they know about, what they can help others with, and hopefully facilitate some of the relational needs that we know folks have. And in addition, we host regular kind of Zoom events that people can come to, which involve some teaching of a practical a tool or a framework, and then lots of breakout groups. So it helps people get to know each other.
Amazing.
And so, we'll be launching that on October 15th of this year, 2025, and we'll be keeping that going for the years to come. So please do check it out if you're interested.
Fantastic. Well, Casper and Angie, it's been phenomenal learning more about the work you're doing. If you'd like to guide our listeners to perhaps contribute, whether it's researchers, philanthropists, practitioners, what might be the most helpful thing they might do if there's something that you could direct them to? Well, we'll certainly put the links to your websites, but if there's any practical steps that you might encourage people to take in terms of growing the spiritual innovation ecosystem, what might you recommend?
I'll add one, which is, well, maybe I'll add two, if I may. One is definitely check out spiritualinnovation.org, of course, and join some of the events that we host if you're interested in just learning or understanding more. But honestly, I think the most beautiful stories to me always happen when people connect locally with an unexpected ally. So if you find yourself as a leader in a congregation or someone who's really steeped in a tradition, to go out and actively reach out to the person who runs the yoga studio or the fitness community or the arts group or the local volunteering organization that seems to be speaking to people's spiritual lives in some way, and say, hey, I love what you're doing. We kind of talk about that idea of accompaniment, of coming alongside. And I think that's really the posture that this is language we learned from our friends at Wesleyan Impact Partners, who are steeped in the Methodist tradition, but to really, without sacrificing who you are and what's important to you, to come alongside someone who's doing something new and learn from them. And then through that relationship, give what you know too, because it's in those friendships and those collaborations often that the most exciting new things emerge. So build relationships is what I would say. How about you, Ange?
Absolutely. Well, one other thing is just having referenced that platform and the resources on it, there is an invitation on the platform to add more resources. And Brandon, knowing that your listeners are there at the intersection of scholarship and practice, that is one specific intersection that we're really looking to help build out is what is the scholarly work being done about all of these changes and about spiritual innovation itself. Casper and I have had a touchstone ever since we started working together that we're out here trying to tell stories of courage and hope. We've really always been looking for where are the instances where things are coming together in a way that these spiritual longings are being met, right? So we really want to understand more about where and why that is happening. And we want to catalyze more of it, right? So for the scholars listening, we're really curious about what work should we be looking at? Should spiritual innovators be paying attention to? It could come from any number of domains. And then for the practitioners, what are the things that you draw upon in your own work? And please share those with others because we want to help strengthen what this whole ecosystem. So that's just a very practical invitation, but it's also one that we're going to be definitely giving our time to in the next couple of years.
Fantastic. Well, it's been really a pleasure. Thank you again for joining us and sharing your insights. And congrats on the wonderful work you're doing.
Thanks so much, you too, Brennan. Grateful to be doing it with you.
All right, folks, that's a wrap for this episode. If you enjoyed the episode, please share it with someone who would find it of interest. Also, please subscribe and leave us a review if you haven't already. Thanks and see you next time.